Welcome back to another episode of the Tech Talks Daily podcast. Now, people living in democracies have for decades drawn comfort from the notion that their form of government, for all its flaws, is the best history has managed to produce. But in a recent book called Surveillance State, Inside China's Quest to Launch a New Era of Social Control, award-winning journalists Josh Chin and Liza Lin document with startling detail how China's Communist Party is striving for something new, a political model that shapes the will of the people, not through the ballot box, but through sophisticated and often brutal harnessing of their data. So I invited Liza onto the podcast today to explore the world of digital surveillance and how a world of all-seeing surveillance as a possible future scenario is happening already. And when I say this, not just China, I mean all over the world, the US, Europe, wherever you're listening to this podcast. Because after reading the book, it opened my eyes to the intersection of data, politics, technology, and the human body. And I think anybody who cares about the future of technology, where it might take us, anywhere in the world, is something that maybe we need to explore. But before we start today's interview, I just wanted to give a quick mention to our sponsors, because this month the podcast is brought to you by Flipper, which is the #1 marketplace to buy and sell online businesses and startups. So, do you run your own online business? And have you ever considered selling your website, your store, your tech, or your app? Because with world-class combined matching technology, dedicated brokers and end-to-end services, all at the most efficient price, Flipper is making it simple to sell your online business. So to get a free valuation, visit my friends at flipper.com/techtalks, where each month thousands of online business owners exit with Flipper. Again, visit flipper.com/techtalks. So buckle up and hold on tight, because no matter where you're listening in the world, I'm going to beam your ears directly to Singapore, where Liza is waiting to share her story. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Liza, and I work for the Wall Street Journal in Singapore now, but I cover China technology. And this has kind of been the structure of the Wall Street Journal since maybe about 2 years ago, when the bulk of our reporters were kicked out of China. So the journal actually essentially covers China from outside of China now. And my remit is to look at things like surveillance, semiconductors, TikTok as a national security threat. So everything that you find interesting, I'm pretty sure I can answer.
Wow, well, there's a challenge. Well, but before we do just that, I want to take you back in time for a moment, before the Wall Street Journal, and learn more about where did your passion for technology come from? What lit that spark in you? And how did that and the worlds of surveillance and security collide for you? Or as they say in those Hollywood movies, what's your origin story?
So I have to be very, very honest. I'm not a tech person myself. My husband has like a computing major, and he's the one in the house that fixes up the router, changes the hard drive on a PC. And I just write about tech companies, and it's just a fascinating topic because, technology isn't just one area, it's so many areas in itself. When you write about technology, you could be writing about internet companies, you could be writing about social media, you could be writing about hardware like laptops, cell phones, anything from Apple to Meta, that's a technology company. And you have semiconductors as well. So the list just goes on and on and on. It's a fascinating subject to just delve in. So that's my origin story. I mean, I'm curious about so many things, and technology is one of the beats that I've really stuck with because it's just so much changing and so much happening all the time.
And I think in 2,200 interviews, that word keeps cropping up, curious. I think so many people in and around the world of tech are just armed with a curious mind and want to ask lots of questions. And of course, when not writing at the Wall Street Journal, you've also written your own book. And it was that book that put you on my radar, which is called Surveillance State, Inside China's Quest to Launch a New Era of Social Control, which sounds sinister off the bat. But can you tell me more about the story behind the book and the kind of wake-up call you wanted to give your readers?
Sure. Yeah. So the genesis of the book is really, a series of stories that my co-author Josh Chin and I did for the Wall Street Journal in 2017 and early 2018. At that point, in 2017, I had been in China for it was about 7 years at that point, and Josh had been in China about 15, and we along with our colleagues were noticing like the state encroaching more and more in the lives of its citizens in China itself. And this is not new, but I'm realizing that these cameras were popping up in sidewalks and subway stations. My typical commute would be I would get in the subway station and I'll take the subway down to work. And between the entrance of the subway station and the gantry where you swipe your card to go in, there were 17 cameras. I remember one day counting and thinking to myself, I'm not sure who's behind these cameras and where they came from. So you definitely saw this like encroachment, not just in the digital surveillance space, but in the way the party just wanted to run the lives of its citizens. And it really became a story for us. I remember this day. It was early in 2017, where at that point I was just looking in, I was following the money. I was thinking what was the latest tech trend to write about. And I noticed a ton of money, VC and PE money, was going into an area in China tech that really never attracted a lot of funding before. And this was AI. And it wasn't just going into every sector of AI, it was going specifically into computer vision. And that's when Josh and I decided maybe we should pay a visit to one of these startups. And we paid a visit to a startup called SenseTime, which is now China's largest AI company. And the moment we stepped into the showroom, we were completely blown away. I mean, imagine like a wall full of plasma screens. And those screens they're basically streaming footage from the road intersection that we had just walked past. So you had all these screens, and the screen was like boxing up objects as the objects went by the camera. So you would see like female, 30s, rich shirt, and then you'd have these boxes around cars as well, in which they boxed up the color, the make, and the model. And it was just kind of insane to see like this happening in real time. And the more we talked to them, the more we realized that they were doing facial recognition as well. And one of their biggest customers was the Chinese police. And that's when we knew, oh, wow, that we were onto something. So that visit led to us writing a series of stories about China's surveillance state and how they were, experimenting with like video analytics in a way that no other country was. And the book, the idea for the book really came when at the end of 2017, when Josh went to Xinjiang. And Xinjiang is this northwestern part of China, which is home to 12 million ethnic kind of Turkic Muslims. And they're mostly Uyghur Muslims. And when Josh got there, he was just blown away by the level of surveillance he had seen. It takes a lot to blow Josh away because he's been in China for 15 years. Mm-hmm. He's surprised, but he's never often blown away. And that was when we realized that, the data collection and the state surveillance there was actually being used to re-engineer a whole like minority group. And that's the point where we decided we needed the space of a book to actually write the true story of what was happening in China.
And as you said, the book there features the story of what happened in China, but I think much closer to home for people listening. We've heard horror stories around how facial recognition is used in the US. And I also recently read that there are more CCTV cameras in London than Beijing, and also how Silicon Valley nurtured an embryonic Chinese surveillance state in the early 2000s and how it still plays a crucial role now. So can you set the scene for me and tell me, how did we get here and how it's actually a growing problem all over the world right now?
It is. And I guess, in order to answer that question, I really kind of need to bring you through like the development of the video surveillance industry. So more than a decade ago, the video cameras that you would probably see on the street, and many of these cameras are probably still on the streets of London, are what we would call dumb cameras. So these cameras didn't have a lot of video analytics with them, right? And you could record video footage, but you needed a human on the back end to be watching that video footage. fast forward to the last decade or so, what you've really seen is the evolution of AI and, the realization that with deep learning, you can train video algorithms to recognize objects or recognize faces. And the prime usage of these computer vision tools are in surveillance cameras. And that's really, that really is one of the technological breakthroughs that has brought us here to today. And that's really the hallmark of like Chinese surveillance systems. In the past, surveillance systems sold by, the Japanese or Axis camera, for example, these surveillance systems, before the Chinese really actually came in and disrupted the industry, these surveillance systems were like dumb cameras that you had to monitor all the time. And was like very time consuming and resource intensive. With these Chinese cameras, what the Chinese did was to add video analytics to the cameras so that you didn't have to monitor the camera footage in real time. If the camera was set to, say, for example, alarm you when an intruder walked into like a secure area, it would send an alert to the police or the security guard. And I think the other big thing that happened over the last like 2 decades or so is just the dramatic cuts in the price of these cameras. And right now, a lot of surveillance cameras, the world's 2 largest surveillance camera makers are in China. They're called Hikvision and Dahua. And China, like it has done with the rest of the other hardware industries, they've really brought down the price. Think of how they've brought down the price of servers, the price of cell phones. They've done the same thing with surveillance cameras. So by bringing down the price, they've also lowered the barrier of entry for people who are looking to buy such huge networks of cameras. And from there, you've really seen like these camera networks being picked up in not just like developed countries or, the wealthier nations, but developing countries as well.
And recent US limits on companies such as Nvidia and AMD have been used to prevent them from selling into China. And the commerce departments have said that it's to prevent those chips being used in a military context. But these chips also play a crucial role in powering the Chinese surveillance machine, I was reading in your book. Can you expand on that too?
Sure. Let me give you a bit of background on what happened with NVIDIA and AMD. So somewhere in late August, these 2 large American chip companies that make mostly high-end chips were given a letter by the US Commerce Department telling them that they needed a license to import these high-end chips into China. And it was highly likely that the license would be denied. Fast forward like a month later, what the US government did was to expand these restrictions so that it wasn't just the people who sold these advanced chips. It was the people who sold machines that made these advanced chips that also required such licenses. It's essentially barring the sale of high-end chips and high-end tool-making machines to China. And the backdrop to this is when you look at the chip industry globally, China still is quite far behind American chip companies, chip makers, when it comes to making such advanced chips. So there's no way, if the US doesn't sell high-end chips to China, that there's no legal way that the Chinese could get these chips on their own or make these chips on their own. So what the ruling essentially did was it was touted as trying to stop China's, advances in the military sector. But there's another reason behind it, and it was in the statement as well. The other reason was that they wanted to stop US companies from playing an active role in the Chinese surveillance state. And I can explain that. So when you look at the chips that Nvidia and AMD make, they're commonly, they're well known for making what you call GPUs. So they're graphic processing units. And these GPUs are absolutely essential to like surveillance, the new Chinese style surveillance systems that you see now. Because as I mentioned, the Chinese style surveillance systems rely very heavily on video analytics. And to do these video analytics, to recognize an object, for example, you often turn to a process called deep learning. And in order to do deep learning, what you do is you feed a computer many images of objects, and the computer algorithm learns from these images, what it's seeing. And then from there, the algorithm in future can recognize, okay, this is the image of a cat. And to do that, you really need fast processing power. And very often, what you really need is a GPU. And these are the chips that NVIDIA and AMD sells. So for China to keep up, to keep improving its algorithms for video surveillance, they're going to have to keep training their algorithms with GPUs that they now are cut off from. The second reason why GPUs are really, really critical, the second reason why GPUs are really critical to the video surveillance industry is because you're processing large amounts of video footage. So think about it. You have hundreds of cameras, and there's a lot of video footage coming into a recorder or some processing backend machine, and you need that processing computing power to run any sort of analytics, or to sieve through the video footage to find that scene of a lady with a red top and blue jeans, for example. For this, the GPUs are often the most efficient and the most cost effective versus other types of chips.
And another topic I feel we've got to bring into the conversation here is TikTok, because it increasingly gets a bad rap for being addictive and how intrusive it can be. I've also read stories about how in China it focuses on educational content, where over here in the US, over here in the UK and in the US and beyond, it's focused more on dumbing down audiences. So I've got to ask, what's going on behind the scenes on this harmless looking app? Should we be more cautious before interacting with it?
Yeah, so it's quite a swing, right? Going from surveillance cameras to TikTok. Yeah. I guess TikTok's been viewed as a national security threat in the US for, the same reason surveillance cameras could be pulled out for, because there is a worry that China is surveilling Americans and collecting American data through the TikTok app, because TikTok, is so buzzy that like practically every American teen is on that app. So there is that fear that a lot of the data is going back to servers in Beijing, and there are nefarious there is a fear that all that data is going back to servers in Beijing and could possibly be used for nefarious means. So for me, like when you think about and when you listen to congressmen talk about TikTok, and TikTok has been an issue since 2020 when President Trump tried to ban the app with an executive order because it was Chinese. And it's because its owner is ByteDance, which is a Chinese company with a Chinese founder and makes most of its money from China. So TikTok's always been in the press, and always in the press because there are worries of data security. In my opinion, the bigger danger to TikTok is really information control. Because when I think about data security and I look at the types of personal data that TikTok collects, it really actually doesn't collect more than what Facebook collects or Instagram. Facebook knows your contact networks. Facebook knows your birthday. People often tell Facebook where they go to school, where they live, what they buy, right? Because you're served all these targeted ads. So I think that if China did want to get a lot of that data, Facebook, Twitter, Google, YouTube, Google's YouTube, these are companies that are very prone to cyber attacks. And a lot of the data from these companies make it to the black market. So if China really wanted data on like the ordinary American citizen, it wouldn't be too difficult to buy such data. And if you really look at the type of data that TikTok collects, I remember writing a story for the journal recently about how TikTok's failed to get as much advertising as people think they would, simply because they don't have the same sort of targeted data that advertisers need. Yeah, because if you use the app, what TikTok knows about you is what you like to watch. It's not really who your contacts are, because you don't often add your contacts. You don't follow your contacts all the time. You follow people who are random strangers that you find very entertaining. So in my opinion, really, with TikTok, the big danger is information control, because it has a very good algorithm. And anyone who's used TikTok can tell you that you're within a week, you can be served up a lot of content that you actually like. And the same algorithm can be gamed by the Chinese government in times of, for example, elections. Would they favor a certain candidate over another candidate? Should they change the algorithm or get the Chinese company to change the algorithm so that the algorithm shows more of one candidate versus the other? There's a lot you could do with information control and propaganda through social media, and you do see it play out in China every day because of the internet controls. And that's why I feel like with TikTok, the biggest danger really is like the ability to control what you can see and influence your decisions.
Yeah, and I think we've seen the impacts on that all around the world as well over the last few years. And for anyone that is new to this kind of subject, though, can you tell me a little bit more about why really we should all be a little bit more wary about the dangers of governments mining their citizens' data, and why state surveillance can be much more alluring than many might think? Because I think it's easy to think that it just happens somewhere else in a different place and it's not going to impact you, but quite the opposite can be true, can't it?
Yeah, precisely. I mean, like the US is no innocent party when it comes to state surveillance, as we know with like PRISM and everything else from the Snowden leaks. I guess just from our own research, I can talk about what we found with China and why state surveillance is so scary. Xinjiang, as I had mentioned earlier, is a classic example of state surveillance gone wrong. If you were living in Xinjiang, and you were an ethnic minority, a Uyghur Muslim, for example, many of them have been called in to police stations to have their voice print taken, their face print taken, like their iris scanned, their DNA taken. I mean, the level of data collection in Xinjiang is quite insane. And I remember one person telling us how his voice print was collected by the police. He was essentially asked to go into the police station and read an editorial from that morning's newspaper, and then they collected his voice print from there. And it isn't just like digital surveillance as well. There's a lot of surveillance and data collection by hand. So Uyghurs are all asked to fill in like what they call a population survey form, where you're asked to declare your religious habits. Do you visit a mosque 3 times a week? Have you gone on like a religious trip to Saudi Arabia? Have you gone to Turkey, for example? Do you have a passport? There's so many different things, various data points that the police collect. And the reason for collecting these data points is because Xinjiang is seen as a bit of a restive region by the Chinese Communist Party. Because over the last couple of decades, a lot of Han Chinese have moved in to what used to be a very, ethnic minority heavy region. And as with every sort of migration all over the world, there have been clashes between the locals and the new migrants. And for that reason, Xinjiang is seen as this restive place and a hotbed for terrorism. So what the Chinese government had hoped to do with all this data collection was to essentially try and collect enough data points to figure out who was a national security threat and prone to terrorism, so that they could quickly take this person away and lock him up. And that's the reason for collecting your face print and your voice print, and your iris print, because there's surveillance cameras all over the city. If they want to spot you, they will. And they know when you're going into a mosque, who's going into a mosque. And the problem with this methodology is it's very flawed. It's hard to pinpoint who's a terrorist just by looking at this person's like religious habits. Just because you go to the mosque 5 times a week or you don't take alcohol, it doesn't mean that you're prone to becoming a terrorist. So it is a very flawed method of looking at things. And if you think this method sounds very familiar, it's because they're just learning what Facebook is doing in Silicon Valley, right? They're learning more about you through like tangential data points to serve you ads. But in this case, the Chinese government is learning more about you through very innocuous like data points and trying to figure out if you're a terrorist, which can really, really go quite wrong. So I think in that sense, like state surveillance is so sinister that we had to really write a book and just get the word out of it on it.
And as I said a few moments ago, there will be people listening thinking this form of surveillance only happens in countries thousands of miles away from them. But can you tell me more about the spread of state surveillance inside the United States or across Europe, or just in areas that people listening might not automatically think about?
Yeah, so one of the things that, I was thinking about this when we were thinking about how state surveillance differed in China and the US. One of the things that really struck out to me in the US is, there was recently the courts had overturned Roe versus Wade. And there was this huge uproar because people were fearful, particularly women. They were fearful that their personal privacy would be compromised. For example, the police theoretically in certain states could ask Google for details on who had been Googling abortion clinics, for example, or, asking an ovulation app details on females who were pregnant and what, and how that ended. And I think that was even a case that I had seen maybe in August, I believe, about a Nebraskan mother and daughter who were charged because the mother had helped her daughter with an illegal abortion, and the police had asked Facebook for their private messages in order to make that charge. I mean, it is just your private space just isn't your private space anymore, and you don't know if the person you are sending a text to might get his or her phone checked by the police. And if you had sent something about possible abortion, you could be put in jail. I mean, some things like that, it's state surveillance, but you don't immediately think about it as like a 9/11 event, but it's still very, very scary.
Yeah, it really is. And I think I read a similar story where any lady that had gone to a different state for an abortion, big tech was able to pinpoint, hey, this person left the state and spent so long here and then came back and wasn't pregnant anymore. And again, could potentially be charged. It's absolutely horrifying. But looking through your book, it does feel like a warning for the future and where we could end up sleepwalking into if we're not careful and continue with that Silicon Valley mantra of, hey, let's move fast and break things. And we're already starting to see the impacts of that. But to end on a positive note, what do you think we can do to avoid walking into this dystopian police state where algorithms might predict our next actions, etc.? Is there anything we can do to avoid that? And is there anything that makes you hopeful about the future?
Yeah, so I think with every technology, there is that check and balance that's needed, the safeguards. And as we've seen with social media and so many other technology areas, the regulation often lags behind what the technology can do and how it's put in place in the market. So I think similarly with surveillance cameras, there isn't like a universal code of conduct on how you can ethically use these cameras. And I think we really, governments really need to, at least with surveillance cameras, there isn't like a universal code of conduct on how you can use these cameras in an ethical way and a privacy protecting way. So it really is like you have to look at these cameras from the point of view, and this is not my point of view, it's in the GDPR. Are these technologies necessary? Is the use of these technologies proportionate, right, to what it's needed for? So I think a lot of these questions have to be discussed in public forums and by governments so that people can come to a common understanding on what's kosher and what's not when it comes to the use of surveillance cameras. I think this is one of the things that developed countries really have to take the lead on, because just having covered China and lived in China for so long, I am pretty sure that they're not the type that would, when it comes to human rights, they're not the type that would come up first. And that's not to say that even with a universal code of conduct, China will change its ways. But what I know is China does want to be a global player. and so do many developing countries. So just having that global standard and check and balance and safeguard on like how you use surveillance cameras goes a long way in educating possibly quasi-authoritarian regions or authoritarian governments on how they should be using these cameras. And I'll give you a couple of examples. For you mentioned London earlier.
Yeah.
I think the UK, the UK does stand out as a jurisdiction where they do have such a code of conduct. So, for example, in the UK, they have what you call a biometrics commissioner. It used to be called the surveillance camera commissioner, and it's under the Home Ministry. But it's an independent oversight body that every year will make assessments on how police agencies are using their surveillance cameras and their biometric collection, just to keep them in check, and just as an added safeguard that they're not abusing such systems. So that's already like one step ahead of like the US and many other countries. So I do think that something like that would be quite necessary.
Well, a huge thank you for sharing your insights with us today. And before I let you go, I'd love for you to leave us with something else. So is there a particular book that you would recommend or has inspired you that you can leave everyone listening with? And I'll add to our Amazon wish list, and I'll add it along with your own book, of course. I'll have that in there. But is there a book that has particularly inspired you or that you can recommend right now?
So why not I talk about a book I'm reading right now? I've been learning a lot about semiconductors recently because it's been so top of the news in the last 2 years. And I picked up a book called Chip Wars, authored by Chris Miller. And Chris does a really good job of laying out how chips came about, how they were founded, how they were invented, and how Intel was founded, how these big chip giants that we now recognize today that make up Silicon Valley actually came to be, and the evolution of chips from initially starting off in like military and weapons and missile systems to being in almost anything now that has an on-off switch. So I would recommend that book if you want a concise kind of history of chips and how the US and China have come to this point where they're in what a so-called tech war, and semiconductors are like the weapon of choice there.
And am I right in saying that most of the modern chips that we all take for granted in all our devices actually come from Taiwan? Is that still the case?
So TSM, so the chip industry is a little bit complicated because you have different stages of it. You have the chip design, and chip design is predominantly still dominated by American companies. So think NVIDIA, Intel, AMD. They're kind of a cut above the rest when it comes to designing chips, logic chips, because there are memory chips as well. Yeah, but after these chips are designed, what has happened over the last decade or so is these chip designers have stopped becoming chip makers. Right. So they've sold off a lot of the factories that actually make these chips. And they've, instead of making their own chips, they now get what you call foundries to make their own chips. And most of the world's chips are made in Taiwan because it is a Taiwan maker that really is the world's largest foundry. And this company is called TSMC. So TSMC makes chips for NVIDIA, it makes chips for Intel. Another big foundry is Samsung. So a lot of the world's chips are made in South Korea as well. So hence, that's why a lot of the chips are in Taiwan.
Gotcha. Well, I'm going to be checking out that book. Sounds like a great read for me. And before I let you go, for anyone listening, wanting to check out the book, wanting to read some of your work at Wall Street Journal or contact you or your team, what's the best starting point for everything that you do?
Sure. I'm available on Twitter. I try and post on Twitter, but it has been less since Elon Musk took over. And I'm also available. So I'm available on Twitter my handle is Liza Lin WSJ. And I'm also, my email is widely available online, lisa.lin@wsj.com. So send me any tips, any feedback, any comments.
Awesome. Well, I'll add those links to the show notes so people can find you nice and easily. So much I loved about chatting with you today, such as your origin story, the powerful insights in your book. I'm going to be following your work from now on, especially on the Wall Street Journal. It's a great book. I do recommend anybody listening check that out. But more than anything, just thank you for sharing your story with me today.
Thanks, Neil.
As she mentioned there, she is a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal based in Singapore. She was also named a Pulitzer finalist in 2021, and prior to Wall Street Journal, I think she spent 9 years at Bloomberg News and Bloomberg Television. But what I urge anyone listening to check out is her book. I'll add it to our Amazon wish list, the book that she wrote with Josh Chin. Because I think we're all surrounded by technology now. We have these devices now, and we know that apps such as Facebook in the West or TikTok in the East monitor our every movements. They keep us scrolling through sophisticated algorithms. We know that everywhere we go, wherever we live in the world, there got to be CCTV cameras watching us. But what happens when you start adding things like facial recognition into that can almost track your every movement? It's no longer just being tracked online. It's when you enter the physical high streets there. And it certainly makes you think differently about the smart cities and who they actually serve. Food for thought indeed, but I'd love to hear your thoughts wherever you're listening in the world. I suspect that every single country that people are listening in are going to have slightly different views, and I celebrate that. I want to hear all different sides of this tale. So please email me now, techblogwriter@outlook.com. Let's keep this conversation going. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are and your experiences and any insights that you can add to the conversation. But that's it for today's episode. So a big thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.